There are problems that affect so many, and yet so few talk about them. Which is why Rabbi Efrem Goldberg and Moshe Yachnes bring you Out of the Shadows, a Jewish approach to mental health. Rabbi Goldberg and Moshe speak to leaders in the field and discuss contemporary challenges to help us better understand mental health and those who are struggling with it. This month's topic, OCD. On this episode, we are joined by Rabbi Dr. Jonathan Schwartz, Clinical Director for the Center of Anxiety Relief and Rabbi of Congregation Adath Israel in Elizabeth, New Jersey. Mordy Gottlieb, a clinical social worker based in Scottsdale, Arizona, who will describe his struggles with OCD. And Rebecca Klempner, an inspiring writer who discusses her experiences and how she has managed her OCD. We hope you find this episode meaningful and helpful, and please be sure to check out the show notes for further resources.
Moshe, it's great to be back together again, and we're so excited to bring another episode of Out of the Shadows, a Jewish approach to mental health. We're so grateful to the Wine Pearl family for sponsoring and enabling this project and more, Adopt program between BRS and Onward Living in memory of Johnny Wine Pearl, a really special man whom we miss. This episode is on a topic, Moshe, that's on everybody's minds.
Perfect timing,
right? Pesach time, certainly for many, is a trigger. We sometimes inappropriately talk about Pesach as an OCD holiday, and we shouldn't misappropriate a term when it doesn't apply. It's really unfair and cruel to people who actually struggle with a real diagnosis. So we have to be careful of the language that we use. And if you're a neat freak or you're cleaning well for Pesach, you're not OCD, don't use that term unless it applies. So when does it apply, Moshe? Talk to us as an introduction. What is OCD?
Yeah, so very good. Thank you again, Rabbi Goldberg. It's always great to see you again and work on this special project. So OCD is, it's an anxiety disorder. It stands for, obsessive compulsive disorder. And really, it's a clinical presentation comprised of two aspects. Number one is an obsessive thinking pattern, intrusive thoughts. And those thoughts are so dominating that it ends up affecting a person's functionality, their ability to feel relaxed and participate in daily functions. And the second aspect to it is compulsion, which is a behavior associated with it, an attempt to try to resolve this anxiety-provoking thought. A classic example is I feel dirty. I'm scared that I'm going to get sick because of the germs on my fingers, and therefore I will compulsively wash my hands. That's a classic example, and it's so clear because it really highlights both aspects of it. The intrusive thought as well as the compulsive behavior is an attempt to control or to alleviate the thought. And that obviously it destroys people's ability to function. It can disrupt relationships, and it becomes very uncomfortable to cope with it and to deal with it. Just to give a brief synopsis, and we'll talk more about this during the episode. But the solution really, not to oversimplify it, is to learn to live with uncertainty. If a person can embrace that thought, that anxiety-provoking fear of what if I get a germ and I get a disease and I get sick, it's possible. Yeah, 1% chance, 5% chance. But if a person can learn into the level that they can embrace that uncertainty, that will dictate their ability to cope with it, and it actually can alleviate some of those symptoms of anxiety and fear. Obviously,
Absolutely.
there's different clinical modalities, medication, as well as some, we call exposure response prevention. But we'll talk about all of that with some of the guests, and looking forward to hearing some courageous stories and giving people some clarity on how to cope with this very challenging issue.
Absolutely. And I see it as a Rav, as a rabbi in Jewish communal life and religious life in the form we'll get into as well, scrupulosity, which is even more dangerous. First of all, for people, they feel the stakes are higher, but also society and the environment can reinforce the OCD problem when it presents as religious or righteous activity. So if you take forever to say Shema or Shmona Esrei, or you are excessively cleaning for Pesach, or you are with kashrus or mikvah questions, go above and beyond, then the society will reinforce, because they say, wow, what a tzaddik, what a tzaddik is, when really the source of it might not be righteousness or religious drive. It could be something which is unhealthy. So we're so grateful that Mordy, Rebecca are sharing their story, each of OCD in general, how it expressed itself religiously. Rabbi Dr. Jonathan Schwartz, a longtime friend of mine, a rabbi and an expert in this area, will share his expertise. It's another great episode, and we're grateful to our guests for their courage. We're grateful for making themselves available and for sharing their stories. Whether you identify with the struggle and maybe find some solutions, some strength, whether you have someone in your family who is going through this and maybe you can learn how to be more supportive, or just in general, every one of us can be more sensitive to this issue and be better with it. We're really glad you joined us, and we're very excited and honored to present the next episode of Out of the Shadows. So grateful to be joined by my dear, dear friend for a very long time, Rabbi Dr. Jonathan Schwartz. Thank you so much for joining and sharing what's become an area of your expertise. I know how many people that you've positively impacted, helped, and we're grateful that you'll help us and our audience try to navigate this topic a little bit. So please, first, help us define what is OCD. We use that term probably to our own detriment, inappropriately and insensitively, when every time of year, this Pesach, we'll talk now about that OCD Jewish holiday. And it's probably cruel to people who struggle with OCD that when someone likes to keep their desk neat, we call them OCD, or everyone with Pesach's OCD. So we should all, I'm sure, be much more sensitive. But aside from that, help us understand our terms. When does being a neat freak rise to a level of OCD? And is being neat the only presentation of somebody who has obsessive compulsive disorder?
First of all, thank you so much for inviting me to join you. Our friendship goes back a wonderful long way, and it's incredible what the two of you are doing to bring even this aspect of life in general and Jewish life in specific to the forefront. During the pandemic, I had a conversation with a colleague up here in New Jersey who turned to me and said to me, the first couple of weeks that the pandemic was on and everyone was washing their boxes and all that other stuff, a lot of my clients were complaining that they felt to a certain degree they were going to be washed away. That is to say, everybody, a lot of them were reporting that everybody was saying that we're all OCD now. And they felt it was like this tremendous disservice to what they were personally struggling with. I think that was a very important statement. And I started to think about it when we get to Pesach time, just like you did. When I think of and conceptualize OCD, I use the letters: obsessive, compulsive, and disorder. And all three are important. Obsessions are things that go through your mind that you can't shake. You get very, very focused on what it is you're thinking about and how you can't shake that thought. Very often that leads to compulsions, whether they're compulsions in behavior or thought. But there are things that we're trying to do to get rid of those obsessions. The obsessions make us very anxious. They make us very uncomfortable. And what we do to try to stop it, whether it's something completely out of the box or something that in our minds we're doing all over and over again, makes a difference. But here's the linchpin. It's in the D. It's in the disorder. And the question basically comes down to, how crazy are you making your life? If it's something that's within your life and everything's okay and you're able to handle it, that just makes you organized. On the other hand, when it starts interfering with your ability to function in life, now all of a sudden we're talking about something that might rise a little bit more to a clinical realm. And it's really more the D that takes the obsessive compulsive disorder and really makes it something that you want to address in real life.
So just to clarify on that, what if it's not actually interfering with your life, but the people around you? So you are, you're highly organized, or you're a neat freak, or you're very obsessed with that thought, and you think it's not interfering with your life. Your life is functional, but family members, friends, coworkers, people around you, it's interfering with them. Does that also rise to the level of disorder?
It's an excellent question. The answer is yes. Obviously, if we don't live as individuals in a society. We don't live on islands by ourselves. If we can't function around our loved ones, then our life is disordered. Maybe we don't realize it. That's what we might call being egosyntonic. It may be something that's consistent with the way we see ourselves, but it leads to a certain style and a perfectionistic style. And it often can really, really be very hurtful to not only behaviors and activities when we talk about OCD, but a little bit more on the global scale when we start talking about things like relationships, relationship substantiation, or perfectionism. And very often there's a parallel diagnosis in OCPD, which often gets looked at in the same realm and in the same context.
Can you share a little bit about, maybe break down what the obsession is defined as? What do you mean by intrusive thinking? Where is the threshold of normalcy or focus versus something that is, dominating our ability to function? Can you just maybe expand a little bit more on like what does it mean when somebody is obsessing, to be able to give language to people who might be experiencing that and they themselves might not understand if they're beyond the threshold of healthy functionality?
Great. So let me use a classic example and one that happened this morning. fellow turns to me this morning and he mentions to me that he's obsessed with Rabbi Efrem Goldberg. Anything he gets a chance to listen to, Rabbi Efrem Goldberg, he runs after. And he uses that word over and over again. And he doesn't realize, A, that I'm going to be sitting with you today, and B, that, to be quite honest, using the word obsessive with me personally is something that, makes me think twice. It sort of like gets on you. In that situation, I don't think he's, as much as I love Rabbi Efrem Goldberg, I wouldn't say I'm obsessed with Rabbi Goldberg. What I would say is that I am able to enjoy every opportunity to learn Torah with and from Rabbi Goldberg. I enjoy the opportunity to share a friendship and a relationship with Rabbi Goldberg, but I'm not thinking about Rabbi Goldberg 24/7. I don't get a certain thought in my head constantly that just keeps running over and over and over again and causes me distress and it causes me anxiety. The latter is a little bit more of what we would call an obsessive thought. Let me give you an example of one from somebody who was in the office here this morning. Fellow comes into the office today and he tells me, I have this certain thought in my head that my gerus wasn't good. The person has been a ger now for about 8 years. He's gone on in life. He continues to function in life, but he's concerned that something happened at the time that he was involved in his gerus that perhaps invalidated everything. And he shares with me that for the last 8 years, he's been thinking intermittently about whether his gerus is okay, and he's been reviewing every step of the gerus process. Sometimes I'll see that with people who are just trying to figure out whether or not they made the right food on the right pot 3 months ago when they were making soup for dinner on one particular night. They're constantly trying to play the thought over again because of some underlying basic theory or basic theme that's lying with them that's making them incredibly uncomfortable. It's the thoughts are causing this anxiety, and as a result, the person is obsessed, playing it over again and again until they can get some sort of resolution.
You use the word anxiety connected to it. Is OCD a form of anxiety at its core, at its root? Is it under the umbrella of anxiety?
So the answer is depends how old you are, and I'll tell you why. When I was in graduate school, and up until the most recent formulation of the DSM, which is the classic book of diagnostics, OCD was listed among the anxiety disorders. For various other classification reasons, in the most recent iteration of the book, they took it out and made it its own system. But there's no question about it. The conceptualization is, yes, there's an anxiety that's associated. There's an anxiety that's fueling the compulsions, and the OCD is the obsessions are pushing the creation of the anxiety, which pushes the person to try to do whatever they can to get rid of that discomfort and that anxiety and stop those obsessions.
So is it fair to say that underneath those obsessive or intrusive thinking is a fear? We know what kind of the legs that anxiety stands on is a fear, or is a projected or an assumed fear about whatever the item is that they're thinking about. Would you say that that's something, if a person's motivated to try to break down or truly understand their OCD, should they try to explore where the fear lies, what the concern is, that's maybe driving that anxiety or those intrusive thinking?
Sorry, I would say yes. It's either a fear or an anxiety of something in the past, something in anticipation in the future, or a guilt, which is fear turned backwards in time, right? And very often they're one and of the same. The excitement of an OCD, in my experience, has been that even if one can understand the theme of a particular individual's OCD, very often, even if it seems to be all over the place, what patients will say to me is, but I'm obsessed about kashrus, and I'm obsessed about Shabbos, I'm obsessed about Taras HaMishpacha, all at once. Those are all over the place. And I'll turn out and we'll sit down and look at them and look at the underlying thought process. And it'll be something very fundamental, something I'm concerned that I won't be a good Jew. I'm concerned God will be angry at me. I'm concerned that I'll mess something up for future generations, each one of which would be a different obsessional theme. But then if it comes up again in a different context, they'll be able to relate to it and be able to be treated as a result.
Can you speak a little bit more about, I think sort of the caricature of OCD, certainly if you grew up seeing this portrayed in different media, is that OCD is the person who washes their hands a million times, or checks that the oven is off, or makes sure the front door is locked, or is incredibly excessively neat. But we've been talking about OCD also being about thoughts, where it doesn't manifest itself in anything physical, but it's thoughts that come back and back and over and over and over again. And an interesting thing I've come to learn as a Rav about OCD is that it can be in a particular area, right? You just gave an example, but for example, I know certain women in the community who are OCD about Taras HaMishpacha, questions that may arise, or another person who's OCD when it comes to kashrus. And she actually once said to me, she said, you probably look at me and you wonder, she said it actually what I had been thinking before I was more educated. She said, you look at me and maybe I don't dress the most modestly, or you don't see me as the most religious, and yet I probably ask you the most kashrus questions, and I do so over and over and over again, looking like I have the highest standards. That probably doesn't make sense to you, right? It's because it's not really about the halacha, it's OCD about kashrus. So can you talk a little bit more again about just helping us understand, those who don't have it, to feel more understanding or empathy, sympathy for those who do? It's not necessarily about being neat or about the front door or checking the oven or the lights. It's about a thought process inside, and it doesn't necessarily have to manifest itself across the board in every area of life. It could manifest in one.
Yeah, I think you said it beautifully. I think that when the people who are directly involved in primarily OCD practice and research, in the United States we have and beyond, we have a group called the IOCDF, the International OCD Foundation. And when we talk about OCD, we don't see it as an all or nothing disorder. We have, I think, between 7 and 11 subtypes, which are, to be quite honest, very different and very varied. And in my experience, somebody who has one particular subtype, let's say about contamination, that a person would be concerned that my place is contaminated, or cleanliness, concern for disease, will not necessarily have it in religion or what we would call scrupulosity. There are subtypes that affect relationship substantiation, where somebody will be very concerned, my spouse is not for me, or how do I know that the girl or the boy that I'm dating is really, really the right one? And they'll constantly be playing it in their heads over and over and over again. And then they'll turn around to the other person in the relationship. Wait, how do you know? How are we 100% sure? I look around outside and I see other couples that just seem happier, right? And they're walking around happier, and there's nothing wrong with the couple. And both of them are doing just fine. They're just trying to find something else. And one of the two is sitting there constantly looking for substantiation. And sometimes they'll ask other people, they'll call the parents, the chassan rebbe, the kala teacher, their friends on the street. Don't we look so cute together? It's more about, in each of these instances, like you said, there's a theme, there's a thought or a series of thoughts that are obsessing, they're causing the distress that Moshe mentioned before, right? And that is an anxiety, and they're doing what they're doing in order to be able to put that anxiety to bed. And when that happens, whether it's done in action, let's say like washing your hands 100 times to make sure that you wash till your wrist so Hashem is not angry at you, or whether it's in thought, where you have to tell yourself in your ear, in your head, that no, it's not a problem. No, it's not a problem. 18 times. My very first OCD case was like you mentioned, a non-religious guy who was about 80 years old, who came in and saw he had an Orthodox Jewish young therapist. And he says to me, oh man, this is great. I said, why? He says, because you'll get what I got. I get bad thoughts in my head sometimes. I said, yeah. He says, so I pull my ear 18 times. I said, why do you pull your ear 18 times? He says, because 18 is high. So I said to him, so why do you pull your ear? He says, because 18 is high. I said, but why do you pull your ear? He couldn't explain, because there was some idea in his head that if he pulled his ear 18 times, that was high. And that was somehow going to be able to take apart his obsessions and lower his anxiety. And lo and behold, all he got was a perforated eardrum.
So is it true to say that the compulsive behavior is directly correlated with the intrusive thinking, and it's almost there as an attempt to undo or to block those intrusive thoughts, or to mitigate them?
Yes, absolutely, which is why when we target treatment, just stopping the compulsion alone is not necessarily going to be able to lower the obsession. However, once a person comes to an understanding in treatment that if I can handle the thought, I can allow things to go down, right? I can see for myself that when I'm engaging the behavior and I'm not doing the compulsion, anxiety actually goes down. And the thought doesn't stay at the forefront of my mind. All of a sudden, it makes things a lot, it's a big lesson for a patient or a person. And as a result, the person learns, hey, wait, I can handle this. And they don't have to go to that other behavior, and it works for them.
Yeah, it's interesting. We've seen that so often in when we're doing an intervention with somebody who's struggling with OCD, where we're able to just differentiate between that correlation between the compulsive behavior and the intrusive thought, just create some space. And if they could embrace the thought and trigger an anxiety, however, and obviously understand that it's fear-based, and then hold themselves back physically from that compulsive behavior, it starts to create space and distance between that pattern. And so often it's a fulfilling negative cycle because they continue to do the compulsive behavior, reinforcing the intrusive thought, needing to do the compulsive behavior again and again and again, continuing that negative cycle. So just putting a wedge between that behavior, which is right, it's a surface level expression and an attempt to control, and the thought, which is harder to control, it starts to reinforce for themselves that, hey, there's not necessarily a correlation, and for me to undo the thought, which is the fear, it doesn't necessarily correlate to me needing to do this behavior, and the behavior can be rested while then I have to just only manage the thinking behind it.
Right. In fact, on the small, we have a technique that we call, which you just described beautifully, called the lay technique. And on the large, I'd say the number one approach to treatment for OCD is built pretty much on the principle in the most beautiful way you just described it, called exposure and response prevention. We present the person with the opportunity to experience their obsession, and then we tell them, yeah, but you don't respond. And they will have their anxiety initially go up, and then they'll find that the anxiety falls within the process, which is exactly what you just described. And it is a very, very highly successful treatment.
That seems to me, again, I'm the layperson in this group, that would seem to me to make sense for, right? So the thought keeps coming back about, did I lock the front door? So allow that thought to come back, and then, go through, remember that you did, and don't let it lead to the compulsion, create that barrier. I understand that. But what about when OCD presents itself only in your head, right? Am I a good enough Jew? Does God love me? Or did I marry the right person? And there's only the thought, there's not the compulsion action that goes with it. So there is no barrier or pause to put between the thought and the compulsive behavior, because there's no behavior. There was only the thought, which is consuming you, that you're obsessed over. So how would that, or what would be a treatment for that, right? Because, before I learned a little more about what depression was, right, when I was a young, foolish rabbi, you'd think about the depressed person who's describing what they're going through. You say, well, just get out of bed, just have some energy, just start doing something, right? So similarly here, right, a person who's ignorant and insensitive would say to the OCD person, well, just stop thinking that, just stop having that thought, which is obviously not effective, and probably, I'm going to guess, actually the opposite. The more you try to stop having the thought, the more likely you'll continue to have it. So when there is no compulsive behavior to create the break, the OCD is presenting only in thought. What, Rabbi Schwartz, Dr. Schwartz, what suggestions would you have for that?
So first things, what you're describing is a condition, as one of the subtypes we call pure O, or I believe described mistakenly as purely obsessional. What they really should say is it's the way you described it, which is pure H. It's purely in your head. Because what you just described and what we, in all your examples, is the person has an obsessional thought. Let's use the one you brought up. I don't know, I'm a good enough Jew. Maybe I'm not a good enough Jew. Or maybe I have a problem in my relationship. Maybe my marriage wasn't good. Maybe under the chuppah I had the wrong intention. And now the person is sitting there in his head going through constantly trying to prove to himself that whatever one of those three obsessions, I really am a good enough Jew, or my relationship is solid, or I did really do it right under the chuppah. I listened very carefully. The person is just playing it over in their head. It is a tougher way to develop an exposure, but we do. I remember a guy I treated a long time ago had certain obsessions every time he started to learn Even HaEzer, and he would learn Hilchos Kedushin. and he would fall apart, convinced that his wedding wasn't good enough. Now, mind you, the fellow was married and had young grandchildren at this point, and he still wasn't sure that he was legitimately married. And so what we did was we had him do some exposure by taking his thought and putting it up in front of him. In his case, every night he was mechabed himself with kriyas haksuba. Every night, this was his, every night he engaged in reading the ksuba, which was really where he thought he had found the problem. And then he would go home and he would go, in his foyer or wherever his ksuba was, and he put the ksuba back, come home, and give his wife a hug and call her, Mrs. So-and-so, and be very excited about the idea. Initially, he had to fake it, but what he was doing in the process was he was allowing himself to be totally focused that the woman in front of him, whether he knew it or not, was his wife, and he was going to stay with her no matter what. And we would try our best in a lot of these pure oaths to bring them out into some sort of action, or alternatively in some sort of what we call in vivo exposure, where we would create a scenario and where a person would expose himself or herself in the mind to the fact that, you may never know. You may never be able to prove that you are a perfectly good Jew. And there's nothing you can do about that, but you'll never know. And here's what we can do. Here's where we're going to do it. And here's how we're going to prove it. It's in front of your face. We're not going to prove it. We're going to let you sit with it and let the anxiety drop. I don't know.
Can you talk a little bit about if a person has identified a real fear that he's obsessing over, and whether it's leading to the compulsive behavior to try to control that fear or not, but it's a legitimate fear, poisonous bugs or germs. The fear is based on some has some merit, and that fear is creating this toxic pattern and the loop of intrusive thinking. How does a person validate that the fear is real, and then differentiate his reaction to that fear when it comes to, alleviating some of the anxiety that's kicked up from that fear?
So I had a friend who was here last night in the office, a former patient from a long time ago, and he says to me, there's a difference between me and my wife. He says, I get nervous about X. My wife has a legitimate fear of snakes. And so she says, I don't want to get treated for my fear of snakes because I have a very simple solution. I live he's a Hasidic fellow. He lives in one of the very large Hasidic communities in the tri-state area. And he says, we don't have snakes there. We have a lot of other things, but we don't have snakes. So she doesn't want to get treated for her problem. I said, okay. And, if that's your decision, so be it. When somebody has a legitimate fear of snakes or of poisonous bugs or whatnot, and it's interfering with their lives, we ask them just in the initial process, if you're going to be obsessed over poisonous bugs, what do you want to do? How would you want to assess that against your ability to function in life? I like to say we have a halachic principle, bari v'shema, bari adath, right? I use it in my OCD treatment also. Here's what you're limiting yourself and you're afraid to go outside unless you're fully covered from head to toe in a burqa, which is not exactly our religion. Right. And you have a choice. That's going to get people to look at you, and it's going to make you very uncomfortable, especially, in the wonderful weather you guys have down in the South, come the next couple of months. So you have a choice to walk around in a burqa or make sure that maybe that poisonous bug that you were worried about coming from the tip of South America will come, and you'll probably faint at some point from dehydration walking around in the streets. Or we can try to find a happy medium. And what we would use is a technique I call Socratic questioning, to ask really where and how far would you want to go, and really how far would that risk go, and then develop the treatment to help the person get from one stage to the next.
Let's talk about scrupulosity a little bit. You said one of the subcategories, and the danger when it comes to a scrupulosity. This is similar. It's a real follow-up to Moshe's question, right? Because it's legitimate to be afraid of poisonous snakes, but when does it move to the realm of OCD? So similarly, right, the person who says, I don't know if Hashem's happy with me, I don't know if God's happy with me, if I'm a good enough Jew. Many of the communities, you'd honor such a person, right? You'd hold them up on a pedestal and you'd say, wow, that's a Yirei Shamayim, it's a God-fearing Jew. Look how obsessed they are with meeting God's approval, getting things right, vigilance and diligence and kashrus and Shabbos and learning Torah. So OCD in the area of religion is even more dangerous because it reinforces the behavior, because you're actually being admired for it, applauded for it, celebrated, even honored for having it. So when does someone know whether their behavior, how do you know if you're being careful to pronounce Shema correctly, or you have a lot of concentration for Shemona Esrei, or you have OCD? How do you know whether you're a Baal Musar learning about Yirah Shamayim and you're thinking often about Dvekas, attaching yourself to God, and all day asking yourself, am I connected enough to God? Or you have OCD? And maybe this is a separate question, but are we doing a good enough job to make sure that rebbeim, rabbis, teachers in girls' seminaries, high school, and beyond are familiar with this difference, so they know whether they should see or diagnose or suggest that someone they're interacting with has an issue, versus they're actually contributing to the issue by celebrating or applauding the behavior, which really isn't healthy to begin with?
I think it was Rosh Shlomo Zalman Auerbach. Those are excellent questions, by the way. And I think Rosh Shlomo Zalman Auerbach once said, there's a mitzvah to be normal, that a person has a chiyuv to be normal. And I think that was, the first litmus test that exists within each and every one of us is, am I being normal or am I not being normal? If I'm looking at somebody and I'm applauding him for being completely off the rails, he's saying Kriya Shema and it takes him 17 minutes to get through Kriya Shema, I think we can all say that that's just not normal. And many of the poskim that I've spoken through cross the spectrum, whether we're talking about Hasidish, whether we're talking about Litvish, whether we're talking about Black Hat, whether we're talking about Yeshiva University style, whether we're talking about more modern Orthodox, whether we're talking about Sephardi, across the board, everyone has highlighted more or less that same circle. And what is that? That being normal is first and foremost. We have to look and see, are we dealing with something that looks and sounds within the norms of the environment that you're in? And so when somebody's acting or behaving in a manner that's way above or way beyond, we have to raise our eyebrows. And surprises, I think that maybe in our day it went a little bit more unnoticed when we were a little bit younger. I don't think the rebbeim were 100% aware that there were resources to be able to deal with the situation. Today's rebbeim and seminary teachers and moras and mashgichim are being trained and being aware a lot faster. And there are wonderful organizations and programs like yours, this one right now, that are really bringing people to be aware. And I would say, a very nice number and chunk of consultation that I get asked on, and many of my colleagues in the Frum community get asked on when it comes to OCD questions, are coming now from the rebbeim, from the rabbanim, from the teachers, from the moras, and from the mashgichim. And a lot of the major programs, whether they're through Azrieli or whether they're through Torah Masorah, that I'm aware of, they are 100% engaging and insisting that the rebbeim and learn about the process. The moras learn about what's going on, that there is an OCD, that it exists, and to learn to identify it. So the answer is, we could always do more. There's always room to make the language common. But at the same time, boy, have we come miles. And I think a lot of that is due to the fact that we've come a lot out of, pardon the pun, out of the shadows. We're not afraid to bring things up anymore. We're not afraid to say these things exist in the community and they exist with our friends. And some of us may have had or suffer. And so therefore, as a result, we're talking about it. And by the way, when it comes to OCD, we're really dealing with a situation where with the right treatment, people can go very, very far, incredibly far.
Yeah, we see that all the time, where it's really a functionality paradigm where, you can have somebody who's super motivated to get closer to Hashem and somebody who's experiencing a manifestation of an OCD disorder, right? And what you look at to diagnose and then ultimately to treat is their functionality. I always say with anxiety, it's like, the people that send those envelopes, whether it's FPL or Con Ed or any, right? If those envelopes, when they come in the mail, if that paralyzes our ability to get out of bed and to go to work, then that's a disorder. It's an anxiety disorder. But if those envelopes motivate us to say, hey, I got my electric bill coming up, I better get to work, that's functionality. So it's the same. It's almost like the same behaviors can be viewed whether it's a healthy motivator or obviously, an anxiety that's paralyzing our ability to function. And
Would you
that's
say so?
something to look at.
Parents and
Yeah.
educators should use that rubric of normalcy, normative behavior, normative boundaries. So if your child is coming home and outside of that normalcy, obsessing about learning late into the night, they've crossed the line between what's virtuous and what we should applaud and what we should admire, what we should celebrate, into, hey, maybe we should get this checked out. That's basically the metric, is what's normative in their environment.
Well, what I would add is, and I say this with a drop of just awareness, obviously sometimes our kids come home after a year in Israel or even Pesach time for a Bein Hazmanim, right? And we notice, to the one hand, that they're not exactly adopting the norms that we, at our standard, they've gone maybe slightly to the right of, or the what appears to be the more religious than our standards. I'm not saying every single kid who makes such a decision is now all of a sudden suffering from OCD. Let's be very clear about that. Children are going to make their own decisions about where they want to fit in an hashkafic realm. But while they're choosing their communities and their style of living, there's a difference between choosing and talking, and they can have healthy conversation about what they're dealing with versus, I have to do this. You don't understand. I need it. It needs to be this way. And at that point in time, a parent would start to scratch his or her head and say, gee, maybe this doesn't seem right. Maybe we should talk about it. And if we can't talk, maybe we want to bring someone else in who can help us have that conversation. Maybe we start with a Rebbe that's trusted, or a Morah that was trusted, or the Shul's Rav, who is trusted, and then be able to sort of advance that conversation, if necessary, over to our mental health professionals to see if there's something that can be weeded out and looked at in order for us to be able to help people.
Are there medications? I know anxiety, there's medication, depression, there's medication. Again, excuse my ignorance, but is treatment for OCD and support, are there medications that are helpful?
100%. 100%. There are definitely medications. A lot of the classics tend to be geared towards helping deal with that anxiety that Moshe mentioned before. And so while medication alone, you're not going to pop the pill and magically your obsessions disappear, right? And they'll never be OCD again. What the best description I've heard for the treatment that is best identified with medication is what's identified for me as medication. It was taught to me by a therapist and a psychiatrist that I worked at the Bronx VA hospital. He says, imagine for a second, I give you a job and I tell you that you got to go run, I'm trying to figure, from one end of Boca to the other, right? And before you get out there in the hot sun to go do that job, I also put a big backpack on your back that has about 50 pounds on it. And I say to you, okay, by the way, you're going to have to wear this on your back when you're going to run. And so you go ahead and you put it on and you get ready and you think to yourself, as soon as I say go, there is no way I'm making it across Boca. There's just no way. So you start to move and you're half thinking to yourself, there's no chance. You walk maybe a block and you're leaning against the street lamp on the corner over there. And I come up to you with a car and I say to you, hey, you know what, Rabbi Goldberg, I have something for you. I pull out a pair of scissors and I snip that backpack off your back. I said, now go. Now you still have to make it across Boca. But let's be honest. You have just had a weight literally lifted off your shoulders. The medication is my pair of scissors. The medication can take down the intensity of the anxiety so that the person who's working with it is now going to be able to turn around and engage and learn to challenge his or her obsessional thoughts without compulsing, and will help the person be able to live, function, and thrive and do the cognitive rewiring that's necessary to be able to differentiate between when am I obsessing and when am I living healthy and how I can proceed further in my life.
Beautiful analogy. That's great. That's fantastic. Really, we talk about the strategic dovetail between medication and cognitive work. And that's such a great analogy to help explain how they can very often sometimes need to work together. And obviously one can't be abusing the other. But sometimes for the right presentation, it's so helpful to have that blend of both medication as well as real clinical cognitive work.
Can you close us out by maybe giving a suggestion of someone who lives with or is related to or close friends with one who struggles with OCD? A spouse, children, a chavrusa, a neighbor, a friend. What are techniques or things we can do to help and support somebody who's with it? So I learned from a therapist, one of the people in our community who has OCD around in kashrus. One of the things was, instead of calling me, then calling back, then calling back, then doubting yourself, then calling back, you email every question. I write back an answer. The person can print it. And then, so they have guests for a Shabbos meal. They've doubt and questioned themselves a billion times about the ingredients, the cooking, their oven. When I've answered and printed it, whenever you need to, you could read the email. And that will allay your thoughts, because you could just reread the same email. It's there, and it's been a technique that's worked wonderfully in this particular case. But if you're a spouse, if you're a child, maybe you grow impatient with the obsessive thought of the person that you love. What are some things that you could suggest to be supportive, to be loving, and to help someone who you love and live with or live around who has OCD?
First of all, let me also add, within your example, I'm going to turn back to the rabbi or the teacher or the Rebbe as well, because I think that what you described in your situation is something that's relevant as much to the loved one as it is to the decider of Jewish law. They're all being asked to perform the same role. And what is that? Provide reassurance. In my practice, I tell my patients that reassurance is one of the Harig Val Yavors of treatment. In other words, the OCD is constantly running in your head, trying to get you to be calm and not handle the anxiety. And you think, if somebody would just tell me that what I did was fine, then I will get rid of my anxiety. That's not going to happen. The OCD is going to play against you. And so therefore, reassurance doesn't help the person build his or her own confidence to be able to withstand his or her own obsessions. If I'm constantly reassuring somebody, what's going to wind up happening is they may develop some confidence in me, but they won't develop confidence in themselves. Rabbi Goldberg, you don't know this, but we had a colleague many years ago who had this problem. It was actually one of the reasons that inspired me to go into OCD treatment, in that he had been asking Shilas to a world-renowned top-level posek that we are both quite close with. And I used to watch it every single day when he would come across and try to prove a particular point. And and the posek would constantly listen and say, "That's very nice. We don't poskin that way, but it was a very good argument." And that was the end of it. And then I found out afterwards that he does this every single day. Went to one of our other rebbeim, a little bit more of a firebrand, but not necessarily known as a world-renowned posek. And he went ahead and he said, to that one, he brought the same question, and the firebrand Rebbe said, "That's a good question. You should ask the world-renowned posek." He says, "What does he know about halacha?" Which is when I realized there was like this big, massive problem waiting to happen. To a certain degree, what the world-renowned posek was doing was basically, he shut the door. He wasn't engaging. He stopped. He recognized that the person asked a good question, and he cut the reassurance. I think as a parent, as a child, as a spouse, as a loved one, or as a Rav or a therapist, we don't provide reassurance. What I do for my patients, and what I try to teach the Rabbanim to do when they ask me, or the Rebbeim, you can answer a question when it's a question. I call it the Reishis Hagez theory. In the same way we don't get too many questions about the mitzvah of Reishis Hagez. If a person comes up and he says to you, Rebbe, I don't know what I'm supposed to do here, and he asks you a question, I call it, like Reishis Hagez, then the answer is, you can answer the question. Okay, I'll tell you, do this, do this, do this once, right? You answer the question one time. After that, when the person comes back to you, and he or she will, right, and says to you, "Well, wait, did you mean this or that, or this or that, or this or that?" Say, "I think I answered your question, right? What do you think?" And I would say that to the parents and to the children, and just be careful to do it carefully with a sense of humor and love and understanding, which is to say, sometimes I like to say, end your statements with a question mark, right? So instead of saying, "No, this is not a problem," or "Yes, we are the most happiest couple in the world," so I don't know, what do you think? I think we're pretty happy. What do you think? put the burden back on the patient, especially when the person's engaging in treatment. When your friend, your loved one, your spouse is engaging in treatment, they will know this. And if they're working with me or people similar to me, what they're going to be told is, tell your loved ones to do this to you, right? You will collaborate. You'll be able to express it. That's A. B, while we don't reassure, we definitely encourage. When you see somebody going through something and you see they've gotten through it, offer that praise. Make sure you tell them, I see it. I see how hard you're working. It's amazing. Being able to encourage somebody, it just promotes the idea that I want to keep doing it again and again. I want to keep striving harder and further. And that's incredible. And that's another wonderful opportunity. So I would say that's the other big mitzvah in OCD treatment. While you don't reassure, you definitely encourage.
It sounds like what you're saying.
Go ahead.
Sorry.
No, go ahead.
No, it just sounds like what you're saying is helping encourage the individual to live with uncertainty. We had this come up with when we did a podcast on anxiety. Really, not to oversimplify it, but to the level that we can all live and embrace uncertainty, that will dictate how we're able to modulate our anxiety. And obviously OCD is an extreme expression of anxiety. It's a first cousin. It's an anxiety disorder, but it's to the level that we can live with that uncertainty and embrace that uncertainty. And obviously collectively and individually to be able to create that environment in our homes. And obviously we have to try our hardest and work our best, but ultimately, we believe that the decision and the result is going to be a force greater than ours, and to the level that we can get comfortable with that clinically, emotionally, spiritually, that dictates our happiness paradigm. So it's that sounds like what you're.
It was enormously helpful to me because it's so counterintuitive. Yeah. I would have thought, as a child, as a parent, as a sibling, just keep reassuring. No, that is the answer. Ask me as many times as you want. I'm happy. I'm here. And it's so counterintuitive, and therefore so important that you've just educated us that don't do that. That's actually feeding the disorder. Instead, answer once, say I answered it, and turn it back on the person. Well, what do you think, or what did you hear me say, or that's really, really important. It makes this whole conversation, all of which was amazing, really worthwhile, because I think it's a very practical instruction to all of us. Rabbi Dr. Jonathan Schwartz, thank you for your time, your expertise, your friendship. We learned a lot, and we're very, very grateful.
Thank you both. You guys are doing amazing things, and I can't say it enough, both as a rabbi and as a psychologist, but also as a member of the Jewish community and a friend to you both. Let me just say, please keep doing what you're doing, because the more that we can step out and develop a greater appreciation for all the faces of Am Yisrael, the better off we're going to be in terms of our ability to work together, to love each other, and to develop a certain sense of unity together.
Amen. Thank you. Mordy, thank you so much for joining us on Out of the Shadows. We really appreciate your sharing your story and your journey with us, and it takes courage, and it's not a simple thing. So thank you so much. Why don't we start from the beginning? If you could introduce yourself, share a little bit about your background, your life, where you're at now, and at what point did you sense that OCD was an issue for you?
Sure. I'm super grateful to be here, and I appreciate you guys having this forum to have people come out and share with others and the community their experience. The first thing I want to share about is when this opportunity came up, I called my parents and I asked them what they thought about me doing it. And, they said, we need to think about it. And they got back to me a couple hours later and they said, we want people to know and you to know that we support you in your journey and that we don't have shame around you having OCD or any other issues. And I spoke to some of my other siblings before and they said, yeah, this is your story. And it's all our story. It's my family, and my family's message to me was, and they want people to know, is that it's okay for somebody to have mental illness and it's okay to support them.
100%, Mordy. So that is fantastic. No, it's amazing that your parents really are role models in reinforcing the agenda here, which is to have this conversation, to keep the conversation going, to have people understand that there are challenges in our community within the context of behavioral health, mental health, and there's a roadmap towards recovery. No matter what the issues are. And that's part of it, to remove the stigma and to address, this issue head on. It's always talk, it's not a shanda that it does exist in our community. And there's so much talent in our community and, proven ways to work through these challenges. So thank you, and thank your parents for that as well.
Absolutely. So tell us, Mordy, where are you now? What's happening in life? And then tell us about your background and how this began.
Sure. So I currently live in Scottsdale, Arizona. Originally, I grew up in Brooklyn, and I did, the regular, what I thought was regular, the yeshiva world. I don't think the yeshiva are particularly important, especially when we talk about scrupulosity and OCD around religion. But I went to the regular yeshivas. I went to Lakewood. I did the regular system, and now I live out in Arizona. And I think before we talk about how my OCD manifested, the first thing to talk about is what is OCD? Because when we understand what OCD is, it makes sense, the behaviors that I was doing. So I'll just take a moment to maybe give a little psychoeducation on that, or if you guys
Sure.
want to talk about that.
Sure, we're doing that also, but absolutely, from your perspective firsthand, please.
Okay, so OCD is obsessive compulsive disorder. The O is the obsession, which is thoughts. And a lot of people struggle with that. And a lot of people that struggle just with obsessive thoughts, they believe that all they have is thoughts. And that may be true. For most, in my experience, people also have compulsions, which are behaviors, whether it's checking, looking, asking, and specifically, seeking reassurance. So for me, my OCD, there's two areas that I want to talk about. One is around personal safety, and one is around religion. So the other part of OCD also is that the core question or the core dilemma or issue for me is I'm not okay with being uncertain. So if, for example, my OCD was that I was afraid that I was going to be kidnapped. So there was no way to know for sure that I wasn't going to be kidnapped. So, but I wasn't okay with that. So it was saying to myself, how do I live with this? 99% I won't be kidnapped. 1% chance I will be kidnapped.
What
Right?
age? What age are we talking about? You were thinking
This
about?
is already at a young age, probably starting at 6 or 7. Traditional therapy will say to me, Mordy, what's the problem? 99% nothing's going to happen. 1% something's going to happen. We got the odds. You're good to go. The OCD is on the 1%, which is the core question, which is what if? That is my problem. My problem is I'm probably okay, but what if I'm not okay? Right? So the other things that I struggled with, fear of getting kidnapped, health anxiety, right? Something's wrong with me. Now, could I know for sure there's nothing wrong with me? No. I went to the doctor at a young age. He told me, Mordy, you're okay. But I know he didn't know for sure that I was okay because nobody knew that for sure I was okay. So the core of OCD really is what if? We'll say, well, what if I'm not okay? Meaning I could go to the doctor and he could tell me I'm okay. I could take x-rays and they could tell me I'm okay. But what if in between the time I took the x-rays and we getting the results, something else happened? So that is the core of OCD is what if. Does that make sense to you?
And that anxiety and that OCD overlaps with a general sense of anxiety. Did it express anxiety in other ways in your life at that young age?
So, I mean, there's an overlap between anxiety and OCD, right? I know the other podcast was about anxiety, and I think that's the core of anxiety is, what if I'm not okay? So some of the other things that I dealt with was fear of elevators, right? Fear of getting stuck in elevators. There were times, and I spoke to my father about this today, and he remembered where I was a young kid, we would go to the city, he would have to get something, a package, and I would wait downstairs because I had fear of going into an elevator. What happens if I get stuck? Or I've walked up 10 or 15 flights at times to avoid taking an elevator because what if I get stuck? Or I would go in an elevator if it was a hospital, because if I got stuck in a hospital, it's probably more likely that I'll be okay. Or I'll check my phone, making sure that I have service, right? So that in case I get stuck, I have service. Now, just jumping around, like I recently moved into an apartment complex and had a choice about what floor I could park on. They gave me the lower floor. And then I saw that my phone has no reception there. So part of me was like, this happened a few months ago. Maybe I should tell them, no, I need to move upstairs so that I have reception just in case I get stuck in the elevator. And the OCD recovery is saying, not that I won't get stuck in the elevator, I may get stuck in the elevator. And when I get stuck in the elevator, I'll jump up and down or I'll yell and I'll figure it out then.
So what you're saying is it's not ignoring this thought, it's almost validating the thought and learning to cope with the thought, learning to deal with it, embrace it. The exercise of trying to knock that thought out of one's mind would not resolve any of the anxiety. It will not even help the person feel more relaxed. It's almost leaning into that uncertainty and embracing that uncertainty.
And you make an excellent point. So people think, or I thought, that if I'm going to do it, let's say around health, right? And as I got older, it obviously evolved to Dr. Google and things like that. I mean, in my life, I've had many sicknesses. I've had melanoma, stomach cancer, brain tumors. I thought I was a very, sick individual. So I think that I'm checking Google, and that's going to help me feel safe. That's my compulsion, right? The reality is that every time I check, I'm reinforcing that I'm not okay. Because if I was okay, why would I check? So must be I'm not okay, and therefore I need to check. So actually, when we think we're getting better by doing the compulsion, we're actually, in a sense, reinforcing that we have a problem, which makes it worse.
Interesting. So you're 6 or 7 years old when this starts. Do your parents, do people around you, first of all, are you comfortable sharing that? Do you tell people, I have these thoughts, I keep thinking about them, it doesn't seem others think the same way I do? Did you not share, but people noticed? Was it your parents, siblings? Did you have teachers who noticed? And at what point did they say, this is more than just a kid with an active imagination, we need to address this?
So I went to therapy at a young age. Here's the bad news about OCD. It's very sad. I was in treatment for 13 months, and I was not diagnosed with OCD till 2 years after I got out of treatment. Mm-hmm. So OCD is, I don't know why. I'm sure Moshe, you could probably talk to it, but it's like it goes on. People don't know about it.
Yeah, a lot of times. I mean, that's an excellent point. A lot of times, the treatment team is not astute to identify the compulsiveness and how there's a link between the checking and the thoughts. So it's chalked up as a general anxiety disorder as opposed to specific OCD. So yes, unfortunately, it is missed. I think that's an excellent point, to be able to really go to the right therapeutic support that understand the difference between anxiety, generalized anxiety disorder, and OCD, because the treatment is somewhat different. And that's a very important point.
Was it interfering with your life? Were your parents or siblings or teachers saying, these thoughts are not just a cute shtick, but it's interfering with us, it's interfering with you, it's interfering with your life?
So I don't know. I don't remember if I told them. I think they were aware something was wrong. And like I said, I was in therapy. And the other thing is, I'm not that old, but this was in the early 90s. Things were different then, I believe. Yeah. I mean, you guys have seen the field evolve.
Sure.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Mordy, would you say that there were any specific experiences that triggered the OCD, or would you say that it was something that maybe you didn't identify at that stage? Really, in general, when people are experiencing some of these intrusive thinking and compulsive behaviors, is there any type of value for them to try to link it to a specific experience, or what are your thoughts around that? And can you share from your perspective?
Sure. Yeah. So my mentor in OCD, and if people are interested in getting his book, but it's a guy, Jonathan Grayson, which has a book, Freedom from OCD, and he talks about everything I'm saying is basically from him. He was my therapist for a while. He says, so you have a similar question in addiction, right? If somebody's an addict, we say, why were you an addict? Because you were molested. Okay, now we heal somebody that's molested. We heal them from that. But now there's a behavioral component where it's like the addiction is a problem in and of itself.
Yeah.
So that, I think, even if you hit, I don't know specifically what it came from, but it became an issue upon itself.
So it's almost irrelevant to really try to link it back to one specific or two specific events. It's really, once we acknowledge it, once people can diagnose, themselves or with a professional, they have it, they need to embrace that and then start to address it in some type of methodical way.
Yeah, and the good news is, and we'll talk more about this as we go on, the really good news for people that have OCD is when somebody's an addict, they come to treatment. Okay, so what do you need? Do I need somatic experiencing? Do I need EMDR? Do I need this? It's really a guess, right? When it comes to OCD, the treatment is clear, and basically everybody agrees what the treatment is, and it works most of the time, ERP, and we'll talk about that later, the exposure and that stuff. But that's the good news for OCD. It's really treatable in addition to medications. I was never on medication for it, but I know that's another component. But that's such good news. When one of my clients identifies they have OCD, I say that is the best news, because now we know how to treat you and it's straightforward.
When you say your clients, what are you doing today?
So I currently work at the Meadows outpatient in Scottsdale, although I put in my notice and I'll be leaving at the end of April, and I'm starting my own practice focusing on group therapy, specifically with people that struggle with intimacy disorders and OCD.
You're using your own experience to try to help people, which is in itself really so amazing and a great example to others. Can you talk about scrupulosity and OCD? You talked about it with personal safety and security,
Sure.
with elevators and your health and wellness and being kidnapped. How did it express itself with religion? Because the danger, and we've spoken about in general on this podcast with others, is that the danger is that when it manifests itself in religion, it can so easily be reinforced and promoted and confused with virtue. Wow, what a righteous, what a tzaddik, what a tzaddik is. Look at their Shemona Esrei, look at their Shema, look how careful they are with kashrus or taras mishpacha. And then the person even is reinforced because they're being celebrated for something that's really unhealthy. So how did you experience that?
I want to answer. Is it okay if I just go back for a moment to something
Sure.
you mentioned? So I know, Moshe, before we were talking about, Patrick Carnes, and it's interesting, by the way, I mean, the name of your podcast, is the name of his book. But one of the things I heard from Patrick,
pure coincidence.
One of the things I heard from him recently in a training, he said that, clinicians that are effective are those that what they tell their clients to do, either they have done or would do. And that's really what I find for myself is when I tell clients suggestions, it's like, yeah, I did that. Like, I get that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Religion. You guys want to say anything about that before I go on to religion?
That's great. That gives you credibility when you're telling to do something you've done yourself.
So the religion, there's another thing about OCD, which I don't think is really well known. Well, it's kind of obvious when I say it, but it's this feeling of not being fulfilled. So meaning, typical example of OCD is people think about hand washing, right? So somebody washes their hands, and typically most people, they feel good about that, and then they move on and do something else. People with OCD, they do it, but they don't feel complete. They don't feel that was good enough because back to the what if. So when it comes to religion, right, and what I believe happened for me, and what happens I think for other people is, and Rabbi Goldberg, you could talk to the Musser movement and all that, but essentially anything I did was never good enough. So I learned, I was learning in yeshiva, but I, went out in the middle and I went for a coffee. So I learned, but I don't feel fulfilled, right? Or a woman takes on Shabbos 5 minutes early, but she's like, why did I only take on 5? Maybe I should have taken on 7. Maybe I should have taken on 8. So what happens? Either one or two things. Either eventually people give up, which is understandable, or they double down their efforts and they try more and more. The problem is it's never enough. So I think part of the issue that I've experienced with other people is like we're living in a culture where whatever we do is not enough. And what I think it really comes down to, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, is we have an inability to accept that maybe God's not okay with me. Meaning I am trying to do it perfectly. What for what? What's the difference? Oh, because Hashem might be upset at me, right? Now, maybe Hashem's upset at me, but I don't want him to be. So let me try harder. The recovery, we're talking about, but the recovery in religious kubiasi is accepting the reality Hashem and God may be upset at me. I have no way to know. And that's okay.
It's even more than that. I think Hashem, for some people, Hashem is much more forgiving than they are of themselves. Yeah. And if they could only embrace and learn and really understand our tradition, that Hashem loves us and he created us and he knows we're imperfect and we're fallible. That's how we are by design. That doesn't mean that we don't have to try our best. It doesn't mean we're not accountable for when we come up short, but he's more forgiving of us than some people are capable of being to themselves. And that's a problem in our whole system and what messaging we're reinforcing about that.
Yeah, I mean, just to to springboard, it's probably a podcast unto its own, but the whole concept of unconditional love, that obviously Hashem has for us, it's by very definition, it's unconditional, it's irrelevant, it's irrespective of what we do and how we behave. Essentially, is Hashem loves us unconditionally. And when you have family systems where children grow up, or partnerships, relationships are condition based, so then a person needs to do more, feels less than, inadequacy comes into play, because the fact that this person, my father, my spouse, will embrace me is based on some external behavior or presentation. It's condition based. So a person is battling this all the time, where my core definition of love is conditioned. So therefore, it ekes into the religious arena as well, where Hashem will only embrace me and love me if I do X, Y, and Z to X, Y, and Z level. So the concept of unconditional love is really that's where families have the opportunity to express, and that's, talks to the whole chinuch paradigm, where a person has the opportunity to embrace their children and their spouses and their family in an unconditional way, where maybe we could disagree with their behaviors and their choices. Obviously, there needs to be boundaries and appropriate, things that take place. But the love, the embracement, the fact that a person, cherishes a relationship is irrespective of the choices that they make, while the choices, they can disagree with. So again, it's a broader topic, but, that which we internalize as love, it may be very different than what Hashem, embraces us with.
It's so essentially people project their own experience with relationships, and they project it onto Hashem, onto God. Instead of understanding the paradigm for what it is, they're projecting and holding God responsible, and that relationship is reflecting their damaged ones, or sometimes dysfunctional or imperfect ones down here. So Mordy, OCD or scrupulosity when it comes to religion, it's interesting. Many people think just manifests itself in taking 20 minutes to say Shema. You're saying it may not even be in a particular observance of a mitzvah as much as it is in someone's head. Does God love me? Is he happy with me? Am I disappointing him? Am I good enough? And they're tortured by that obsessive thought.
Yeah, and is it okay if I push back on something you both said? Would that be okay?
Please.
Sure.
So, the problem with somebody with, right? So I what I'm hearing you guys saying is, Hashem loves us unconditionally. The problem with somebody with OCD is there's no way to know that 100% for sure.
Mm-hmm.
So you're telling me God loves me unconditionally, but I could tell you, probably, but since it can't be proved to me for sure, I need to come to a place where I accept that maybe God's not okay with me, and that's fine.
Interesting. So, I would perhaps reframe it where it's not the relationship component, meaning Hashem does love me unconditionally, but the service of Hashem, the actions and behaviors, that is where the uncertainty lies, and that's okay to embrace the uncertainty.
Good.
Which is different than the relationship component. That's all.
I think we're on the same page. It gets complicated because in yeshivas typically, and we're trying to raise families that focus on Yiras Shamayim. We have to have a healthy dose of awe, fear of God, and it's not a free for all. People aren't created in this world to do, what they want as long as you feel good. So how do we, on the one hand, instill, like you were describing, Mordy, how do we instill this awareness, this mindfulness, this investment in a relationship where we surrender, we submit, there's a higher power, he has expectations, and yet not a paradigm where, therefore, if we think we've made a mistake, we can't give ourselves room, or we, like you were saying, that we have to be okay also with, even if there will be consequences, or we're imperfect, or we're disappointing, we don't know, and we have to be okay with that not knowing. And that balance is really important to introduce to our system.
Yeah, and it's important for people like Rabbanim to understand that balance, because it's so nuanced.
Yeah, and in a classroom, in a yeshiva, in a beis medrash, in a shir room, in a shul, in a women's shir, in all these settings, now I'm speaking as a rabbi, but what I'm hearing and learning from you is we should be aware that you don't know who's sitting in front of you. So you speak as if there was someone who has scrupulosity, OCD, or whatever in front of you, and be sensitive and be nuanced in your thought. You might want to give some fire and brimstone, musar, geschmack. You're going to scare everyone into where they're going to rot and what they're going to burn and what's going to happen if they don't. But if you could fast forward that scene and understand damage you could be doing. First of all, I don't know that ever inspired anyone really, but even if it did, what are the casualties in the way? And so we should be sensitive how we parent and how we speak, while at the same time being firm We have
Yeah.
boundaries. We have values that we believe in accountability. There is a Torah. It's not negotiable. And that nuance, that balance between the two is really important. Let's pivot. If you can share with us a little bit about what's worked for you. You said something so hopeful, and I hope the people watching and listening understood what you just said. So hopeful that OCD is something that can be managed, navigated, tackled. What's worked for you?
So I'll talk about the things that I struggled with, like in 2020 when I really sorted out treatment for it. So one thing was I had this fear. So it came up when I was in yeshiva. There was once a period of time when a couple of bachrim, they just didn't wake up one day. This was years ago. And I got this fear that if I fell asleep, I wouldn't wake up. So I would stay up for long periods of time until I couldn't stay up anymore. And eventually I would fall asleep. And the other thing for people to think about is how come things come and go? Like I had that, then it went away, then it came back. And the answer to that is because, and this is good news too, OCD is not a reality. OCD is based on how I feel. Now, how do we know OCD is based on how I feel? So we could do a simple test right now, if that's okay with both of you. Would that be okay?
Sure.
Moshe, who's somebody you spoke with just before you got on the call?
I spoke with a colleague of mine.
Colleague. Yeah. Who do you have? Rabbi Goldberg. Who are you? Anybody you were in touch with?
My wife.
Wife. Are those people alive right now?
Yes.
Right. So you just lied, essentially. That's not true because we don't know, right? Maybe. Is it possible? Maybe. So what you see is that it's based on how I feel about it, right? We all get into cars every day, right? And there's probably more of a chance I'm going to die of a car accident than being 33 and getting cancer. So the good news is that it's just about how I feel about the situation. That's why, just like our feelings ebb and flow, my OCD ebbs and flows, because some days it feels different. Some days I feel okay with it, and some days I don't. Mm-hmm. So the recovery for OCD really is accepting the uncertainty. So we'll put the religious piece on the side, but going into elevators, there was a time in my life, my parents were with me. We went on a flight. I did not get on the flight because I was convinced there was a terrorist. I was absolutely convinced, and I did not go. And they went, and I was convinced that they would die. So the solution is, we call it exposure and response prevention, which is basically means leaning into it. So an example is recently I was flying back from New York to Arizona, and I saw a person that I deemed was a terrorist, right? And in my head, everything made sense. There was from a foreign airline. There was a tag on their bag that says, this has to go in the cabin. So to me, it made sense. It's over, Mordy. Don't go on the flight. It's not safe. Right? So that's OCD. The recovery is saying, yep, I accept that this plane may go down. But I also accept that if I take a different flight, it could also go down for other reasons. So the recovery is saying, not that I have this symptom and I want to know for sure it's not going to happen. It's saying, accepting the truth, this may happen. So for example, at the beginning, I had a lot of fear about health. I would just write down on a page, I have cancer, I have cancer, I have cancer, I have cancer. And then in my head, don't push that away and say, oh, I'm probably okay, I'm probably safe. In my head, say, I may have cancer. Because that's the truth. So now let me paint the picture for you. I get anxious, I get a sensation, right? My heart starts butterflying, right? Maybe maybe I'm getting a heart attack, maybe I'm sick, right? So why do I get into my head about it? Because I'm trying to convince myself that I'm for sure okay. Well, I'm probably okay. Must be. So as soon as I could tell myself, Mordy, you might be dying of a heart attack. Either go to the hospital or be okay with it. Now, I'm not going to go to the hospital because I'm not an idiot. I know that. Now, some people do that. That wasn't my particular thing. But it's obvious to me I'm not that sick that I'm having a heart attack because I'm not calling anybody. So the solution is saying, I may be having a heart attack right now, and that's a possibility. I'm okay with that.
Yeah. So it's amazing. So the treatment is not to try to persuade or argue that it's a silly fear. It's to say, yeah, that fear might be grounded. It might be a reasonable fear, but you have to learn to live with that possibility.
And some of the scripts that we've helped people work with in the different programs is an if this then what question. So if this then what, right? And have the individual really like lean into that and identify, if this, then what? If this fear is true, then what? And they can go through the most extreme scenarios, document it, express it, share it, and you'll see the in real time their anxiety levels will decrease. If this, then what? They'll embrace it, and they'll realize that, hey, I could talk about it, I could experience it in my head. Then what? Well, then I'm still here. Or then whatever the if this, then what? It's a script. It's a something that, it's a tool essentially that we use to help the person embrace that thought, and then realize the then what happens or not happens. So that's again another trick to battling OCD, and it's part of the exposure response prevention paradigm. That's
It's so counterintuitive, and it's great for the
Yeah.
listeners who don't have a direct experience with OCD to learn this, because you would have said to me, somebody, let's say, perseverates that I left the front door unlocked. They went away on vacation. Now all they're thinking about is the front door might be unlocked. I would have
Yeah.
said, well, let's walk through the steps. Do you remember locking it? So it's locked. Like, drop it enough already. It's locked. The odds are it's locked, and there is somebody. It's locked. And what you're explaining is, no. The answer is, it's possible it's not locked. The likelihood is it's
Correct.
locked. It's possible it's unlocked. And if that were the case, it's possible somebody could rob us. But now accept that possibility and let's enjoy this
Correct.
vacation.
If this, then what? And it was the fear paralyzing the individual. So really escalate. Obviously, you want the individual. You don't want to put more fears into their brain. But if they are okay thinking about somebody will then break in. So then if they break in, then what? Well, then they rob me. Okay, then what? Then I have to find another job, or I have to work a second job. Okay, then what? And you can watch and experience a person de-escalating as they embrace their ultimate fear, because what paralyzing them is not the reality of the thought, but it's the fear of the thought. And you're almost giving weight to the fear, and then having that person internalize that fear is, it's basically a hot air balloon. It's not real. But the
Amazing.
Perception of the fear is what's paralyzing. So you want to poke a hole in that fear by embracing it. And then obviously the rationale will come and help the person determine that what is fearful is fear itself. And that fear is not reality. And that's how a person is helped through this process.
And if I get on to that, if then what, the way I see it is like, if I get cancer, then what? Then I'll deal with it. Just like if I got into a car accident, I'll deal with it then.
Yeah.
Because that's the way we deal with most things, right? We don't think about many things we do, even though they're dangerous.
Mordy, you've been very generous with your time and very courageous to share your story. In our last couple minutes, could you speak to others who struggle with OCD? What would your message be to somebody who's watching or listening to this who says, I relate to so much of what they're talking about, and it's debilitating me in my life? What would your message be to somebody who struggles with OCD? And what would your message be to the family and loved ones and friends, what they can do to be supportive of somebody who struggles with this OCD?
So the most supportive family members could be, and this sounds mean, and you probably should tell the person before you start doing it, is when somebody comes to tell you that they're anxious or they're obsessing about something, is not to reassure them. And the reason is because it doesn't work. I mean, if reassurance worked, I wouldn't be here. People reassured me my whole life. And to really help people embrace, hey, I may be having a heart attack. Yep, that's true. And it sounds funny, and that's the truth. If somebody tells me, like, let's say, for example, for me, right? People tell me all the time, Morty, don't worry. You're going to get married. You're going to have a shidduch. And I say to them, that's not true. I wish that was true. It's probably true. But people lie to themselves all the time and say, it's going to be okay. It's going to be okay. But for somebody with OCD, if there's a 1% chance it's not going to be okay, the reassurance is not going to help. So that's a message to families. The other
Which
thing
talks
is
to this counterintuitive, what you mentioned,
Yeah.
Rabbi Goldberg.
Yeah.
It truly is counterintuitive.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think people really need support around this. There's so much shame, right? People have OCD around that they think is the weirdest things. And then they'll come to a group and I'll be like, well, this person, doesn't leave their home because they're afraid that the gas is still on, or like this person is afraid to pick up a knife because they may stab themselves, or this person's afraid of molesting people. Like, I think there's so much healing about hearing other people's stories. And I think it's the power of the group, because it's hard to support yourself in getting through the exposure, but having a group doing it together with other people, I think is super helpful.
Amazing. Mordy, we want to thank you for your time, your courage, your insights. They've really been wonderful. It's been a great, great conversation. And we wish you atzlacha, wish you a lot of success in finding that shidduch and in this new business, in the new endeavor as well. And a beautiful Pesach. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. And if people want to reach out to me, both on a professional and non-professional level, I'm happy to support people. You can email me at Mordy, which is MORDY at thegamechangergroup.com. So Mordy at thegamechangergroup.com. And one more thing for my parents, if you know who my parents are, which a lot of you may know them, you could absolutely talk to them as well. And they're happy to support people in the community.
That's amazing. That's really fantastic. Thank you. We're so grateful to be joined by Rebecca Klempner. Rebecca, thank you for being willing to share and the courage to allow your experience to guide and to validate and to inspire others. Thank you for giving your time and for having written about this subject. All your writing, wonderful across so many different platforms, wonderful not only for children, for adults, but particularly on this subject, I know resonates for people who are looking to be able to relate to someone like them from a similar community background, someone who could be their neighbor or friend next door. And you've given them a voice. So thank you for joining us.
It's a pleasure. Thanks.
So Rebecca, just start by telling us a little bit about yourself, about your life now, and about where this OCD began. What age were you? When did you notice it? Did others notice it? When was it officially diagnosed? How did you come to understand that this was out of the ordinary?
So I kind of want to start with today, because today I have to say that you always will have little moments, especially if you're overtired, overstressed, if you're sick, you'll have moments that it will come back. But you'll get what's called sticky thoughts. I don't know if you guys have talked about this yet, where you have invasive thoughts, which everybody gets. But in somebody with OCD, there's usually a level of shame associated with it or discomfort with it, where it rubs you a certain way and it gets sticky, is what people like to call it colloquially. And those thoughts will sometimes come back. But at this stage, I'm not actually having it's not a really daily struggle for me the same way as it used to be. I'll tell you what it used to be like, though. So I initially was told I had OCD way after I had started having symptoms. I had it. My first symptom was at a pretty common age, which is 9. A lot of times you'll have the first little hints at 9 to 12, I think, is when they usually get the first tiny little hints. And then it's through your early 20s where you start having flare-ups where it's much more acute and it starts disrupting your daily life. I had gone in because I was having depression symptoms. And they said, well, you're moderately depressed right now. But by the way, you have OCD. Did you know that? And I said, I had no idea.
This is at 9.
No. So this is later. So this is much later.
This is later. Okay.
At this point, I'm in my 20s. And when I told my family members, because they had lived with me at 9, they laughed because I would have 2 major symptoms. One of them would be is if I got stressed out, if I was near something that had, for example, tiles in a bathroom. They don't do it as much anymore, but it used to be pattern tiles in the bathroom or even on the walls a lot of the time. I would go into the bathroom, not to use the bathroom, but to count the tiles and look at the patterns in it because it was extremely soothing. And somehow I felt if I could just count the pattern, it would make me feel better. Okay. Mm-hmm. It's a little strange. Okay. The other thing is something that not everybody with OCD will get, which is that you get invasive thoughts that are it is almost, but not quite an image. And it's different than a hallucination in that it's not really there. But somehow you keep feeling like you see this thing in the corner of the eye. And for me, it would be weird things like my grandmother, who's super anti-smoking. It was as if she was smoking a cigar or a pipe. And it was very strange. And then I started with the hand washing, which I haven't actually done for a decade and a half at least. The hand washing, excessive brushing teeth, stuff like that. But it's actually the first symptoms weren't even what you would think of as classic OCD symptoms. And the ones that troubled me most weren't actually that. I also did a lot of checking behaviors. So what happened is,
can you actually outline what does checking look like? How does how do those symptoms show up for a child, a 9-year-old, a 15, a 10-year-old?
So a 9-year-old is, say they put their homework in their backpack and then they put their homework in the backpack. They even may have a visual memory of putting the homework in their backpack because they're going to check it. And then on the way out the door, they're going to check it again. And then the car, they're going to beg you to pull back into the driveway to go see if that's in there. Is it really in there? They remember doing it before. They will have other people around them having remembered them doing the thing, but they want to check it again. That's the kind of thing we're talking about. A lot of times with adults, it'll manifest with medicine. You have a pill minder and you have your pill. Did you take the pill? You go back and check it. And I ended up making a rule for myself because checking one time is normal. Checking 2 times is OCD. So you actually have to put a limit on it, because what ends up happening is, what I think we'll get into later, is with a lot of the compulsions and the phobias, which are the things that really start interfering with your life. Compulsions and phobias, you give into them, they get stronger. It's the opposite of an itch. If you have an itch and you scratch it, eventually, usually that itch is going to go away. But in this case, you itch, the itch gets worse, and it gets worse and worse.
So
You
Rebecca,
mentioned that
for the parents,
Sorry, go ahead,
listening-
Moshe.
yeah, no, for the parents listening that are concerned, or perhaps they see red flags for their children, at what point would you suggest the family member, take this to the next level? Perhaps is there a pattern that they want to see, checking homework versus checking if the socks are aligned in the drawer? Like, are there some practical examples that you could really give folks out there that might want to say, hey, this is happening, or this might be happening, to just raise the awareness a little bit?
So I think what will be really useful is if you notice that in your kid or another family member, is to almost journal it down. Take note of what it was, why you thought it was a little strange, and when it happened. And if it starts coming up a lot, that's a red flag in of itself. But another red flag is, how do they feel about it? Because what's different between a person who has OCD and might be checking something, and a person who has an intrusive thought, and then a person who has OCD and is having it, is there's an emotional temperature that's different. It usually involves fear or shame. The person is super, super ashamed of the thing they're doing, may even try to conceal that they're doing it or deny that they're doing it, or they'll feel like the stakes are super high. It's almost as if they feel like it's a life or death situation. And in a situation like with that little piece of homework, or did I brush my teeth before bed? Oh, I have to get out of bed and keep doing it. Instead of being like, I can let go of it because you reassured me that I'd already brushed my teeth, they're going, no, I have to do it again. Almost as if something terrible will happen, which actually might be the self-talk that you're not aware of what's going on in their head. It might be that they think something terrible will happen if I don't do it right. And I haven't done it right yet, so I got to repeat it. And so if the emotional temperature of what they're doing is really, really high, even if it hasn't been persisting for a very long time, that to me in of itself is something that's worth investigating.
That's interesting. You said that later, when you disclosed that a therapist said, in addition to some mild signs of depression, there was the OCD. Your family looked back and said, yeah, of course, we knew that since you were young. But nobody had said, let's try to intervene or get to some help. Would you have been receptive at a young age or as a teenager for it? Did you feel that you were different or unusual? And why do I have these thoughts and compulsions when my friends don't? I wish that someone would notice, or there was someone to turn to or go to get help with it.
So it's interesting. I'm not exactly sure what I would have thought. Part of it is because I didn't have it so acutely that it was interfering with my daily life so much at that point. And I'll tell you in a minute when it got really bad. But it really, what I think really also hangs you up is that a lot of people have pictures from pop culture, from things they've read, from people making, slang jokes about, oh, I just saw a little OCD about that. Is they have a picture about it, that it has to do with orderliness, or that it has to do with cleanliness or something like that. And that wasn't actually really so much my problem. And so if you think it looks like one thing, and then people are saying, well, this other thing is what OCD is, then you're not necessarily going to put the two things together and be like, but I'm not like that. And so I'm not exactly sure how I would have reacted at the time. But I think now, I'm 47 years old. So there's a lot more awareness now. And I think that nowadays, if I were a kid again and somebody said, you might want to check that out, I think I would have been much more receptive.
And it's amazing because even as an adult, when we're diagnosing or treating OCD, sometimes what comes up is that the compulsive behavior is actually checking. It's seeking that reassurance can become compulsive in its own right. So the obsessional thought is needing that reassurance. It's addressing the fear. It's the anxiety associated with the intrusive thought. But the compulsion is not necessarily a physical manifestation, but yet it's actually a verbal checking of that which they're thinking about, that which is dominating their thought process. So it's just something that I'm happy you brought that up, because it does demonstrate, and it shows up in different variations at times for different people.
Rebecca, you mentioned it got worse as time went on.
Okay,
as a frum woman, as a religious woman, did it express itself, right? Pesach time, does Pesach time become a trigger for it? For some, it's kashrus questions. I have a woman in my community who I know is regularly asking, every time she hosts people, she second and triple guesses herself. Am I feeding them kosher? What if I'm feeding them something not kosher? Are you sure the symbol's okay? For others, it's taras mishpacha, laws of family purity, and issues around the mikvah. Did you find challenges navigating this within the religious context?
So that is 100%. That's exactly where things started becoming amok. I became religious actually it was slower than most people's processes, from like my teens through until I was about 25. So right before I was 25, I got married, and it was also right before Pesach. So one of my first memories of being married is me having a complete and total meltdown, where my husband was like basically put me to bed. He put on a Torah tape. I still remember what the Torah tape was. And he said, I will take care of things, because what had happened is I got into a point, and I had cleaned for Pesach before, but this was for some reason, something about the newness of the situation or something. I'm lying on my bed, and it was as if, like, imagine the more contagious than COVID, like the most contagious thing ever. It was almost as if chametz was like swarming around me, and it was everywhere, and there was no physical way possible for me to tackle every single piece. And that's like, and then because you have an emotional, but also a religious, spiritual component, the stakes feel so high, and it gets to a point where you almost become dysfunctional. You are so overwhelmed by it. And I know people who also have it just for kashrus year round. And like you said, taharas mishpacha, I had issues where I was asking extra shilas. Now, I did not push it to the level I know some other people did, but if you're coming with the taharas mishpacha shaila, and the Rav sees that you're asking questions and you're asking them again and again. And another thing to look for is the person asking for leniencies, or are they asking for things to become stricter? You're not sock shopping for like the easy way out. You're actually making things harder on yourself. That can be a sign that you are actually struggling with OCD. So instead of getting that kind of reaction, it's actually not my personal Rav. My personal Rav cannot do Taharas Mishpacha shailas because he's colorblind, I believe. And so we went to a different Rav who specializes it. And the reaction was, lady, don't be silly. It wasn't, oh, maybe you have an issue. It wasn't like leaning in and being gentle with curiosity. It was almost like making fun. No, not exactly making fun, but it wasn't with the same kind of delicacy that I think was needed. And then what ends up happening is I get pregnant. And when you are pregnant or going through menopause are two major trigger points for a lot of mental illnesses, particularly OCD. So people think about people getting postpartum depression, and now we know it actually can start during the pregnancy. Well, OCD is the same way. So with my second pregnancy, I had, again, weird visual things where I would have thoughts, but they were almost visual thoughts that my baby, I had, you know how like a lot of times you have your baby with the bassinet right next to your bed. So it's like a few days before my due date, and I have arranged everything perfectly. So if baby comes tomorrow, we will be okay. And it was almost as if I could see the baby already in there. And I showed up at the doctor's office. And again, this is several years back. This child is about to turn 18. And I showed up at the doctor's office. And rather than being like, that's interesting, that might be OCD, the doctor freaked out, backed out, said, I just made you an appointment at the psychiatrist's office, who also didn't know what to do with me, because at the time they didn't really understand. A lot of people, practitioners even, did not understand that you have to do things like CBT. You cannot just do talk therapy and expect somebody's OCD to go away. So they basically slowly back up, make this appointment, and said, you're going to go down the street. I go down the street, and they're like, yeah, there's not much I can talk to you. Tell me more about your parents. And I thought, this is not helpful. So I didn't actually get the help I needed at that time. And it only became when I started developing some very serious phobias and some kind of strange behaviors that actually interfered with daily life. Like I would go to the produce store and I would count out it's actually a scrupulosity thing too. You know, in the Gemara, it talks about how odd numbers can are better for not attracting dollars. Okay. So you don't want to have even numbers. So I would go to the produce department, and I always had to drop in an odd number of produce in the back. To the point that if I didn't do it, I counted something up at the register and it was an even number, I would get out. Even if it was a long line like Pesach time, I would get out and go all the way back, get one more item, put it back in. That's, you know, you do stuff like that, or checking how many times you lock the door, but you have your child and you need to go to school, or you're having phobias while driving that cause you to, be afraid you're going to have an accident. You're hyperventilating while driving. That's a problem when you have kids who have to go to school by carpool.
So this must have been very overwhelming for you. What did you do as far as intervention? What did some of the treatment look like for you when you were able to recognize, hey, this is not okay, it's affecting my functionality? Can you outline some of what has helped you over the years?
So I have to say, having a lot of supportive family, and also like when I did mention it to people who were like in the Orthodox community and they were supportive, that helped a lot, because one of the first things happened was as I was opening Hamodia, and there was an article by the late Rabbi Dr. Twersky, and he described some of the stuff that was happening. Also, when I was davening, I would have intrusive thoughts while davening. So he described a patient who was almost exactly like that. That's how it started for this patient, the intrusive thoughts while davening. And he said, this is a sign of a person who has scrupulosity, which is a form of OCD, and they should get help, and there is help available. And I thought, and then I saw an article also in Hamodia by Dr. David Rossmarin. And he does a lot of work with OCD. So just knowing that there are other people around who have it and they've survived it and there's help available, that was amazing. The other thing is
just to interrupt you. That's why it's so great that you're on this podcast and you're sharing your story. It takes courage. It's not easy, but someone listening right now, just hearing your voice is giving them hope and strength to know that they can also live a different life.
So this is like, it's like, this is why I'm doing it, even though it's like, getting ready for Pesach, but I can do it. The other thing that really helped was I was actually in a parenting support group, and it just so happened, Hashem arranged it obviously, that the person who was running it also had a specialty in helping people bust phobias. And I was really, this phobia with the driving in particular was really like, it's starting to get to the point I was having problems riding in a car, not even driving a car. I would have intrusive thoughts. I'm going to get hit. This car is going to slam into the side of my car. It's going to kill me and my kids, or I'm going to drive it, and God forbid I kill my kids. Like, that's the kind of thought I would have. And it was like, you're driving through a stoplight. You can't stop in the middle because you're having a panic attack. It was not a good situation. So she actually said, we're going to try it for, I think, 3 weeks. And if not, we're going to put you on medicine. So this is where I differ than a lot of other people. Most people will need to be medicated to get to the point where you're fighting a really, really serious compulsion or a really serious phobia, because it's almost physical discomfort. Like, some people will even vomit when they're trying to confront it. You have to be able to get through it, and it's painful. So depending on how much you can tolerate that pain and discomfort, that's going to be the depending factor on whether you have to be even temporarily medicated to help you do it. In my case, I did not have to do it. She gave me 3 weeks, and she said, first you get in the car, then you get in the car, and I want you to drive 1 block. Now, the next time you get in the car, next day, get in the car and see how far you can drive.
Rebecca, I just want, if you can outline the details, what is the experience like going through the exposure? Because we could talk about, it's exposure, response prevention. Can you outline for the listeners what happens? What does it feel like when you're actually driving that first block, when you're starting the exposure process? And what type of strength do you lean on in order to encourage yourself to say, okay, tomorrow's exercise is going to be 2 blocks?
So one of the great things is, at the time I was seeing a therapist who was, she was from, and she gave me a lot of mantras, and she helped me design my own. And in fact, I found later on, I had a different therapist who was she was religious, but Christian, but she was also she didn't insert her own religious thoughts, but she did the same thing where she encouraged me to tap into Amunah. Amunah was actually really, really helpful, because you think Hashem runs the world. He is going to watch over me. And one of my first ones was, I'll do my best. Hashem does the rest. So I would say this as I'm driving down the street, I'll do my best. Hashem does the rest. Okay. So that was like one major thing. Also, a lot of that feeling we were talking about, the extreme, like almost like physical discomfort you get if you don't cave into the compulsion. You feel like bad things are going to happen. It's often like you're in a situation that's stressful or fearful, and there's that fear. You want to control things around you in order to make there be no fear. So if you're trying to control other people around you, or you're doing things that are disabling you, you're actually out of control. But to you, it feels like, this is me trying to make control. So if you remind yourself, Hashem is going to control the situation, and no tiny thing I do is really going to make like the world disrupt. Like, the whole world is not going to collapse because of something you did when you didn't give into your compulsion. That also is helpful. You like, Hashem's running the world, and I am not running the world. So that's helpful. That said, you get in the car, or whatever the thing, you're afraid of spiders, you're afraid of whatever. And it's almost a physical sensation of, you want to like literally, as I said, some people will vomit. I would just get a panic attack. I would be hyperventilating. I would be like almost to the point where I have to put my head between my knees. And I would be thinking, it's almost as if, you know how like if you see something, like, have you ever been in a car and you see an accident happening, and you can tell the second before the car's impact, you're like, oh my God, that's terrible, I have to make it stop. It's as if your body is doing that to something that's nothing. Like it's not actually, it's like an imaginary danger. So you're driving down the street and there's no possible impact down the road. There's no giant pothole. There's nobody darting across the street or anything, but your whole body is telling you as if you have to stop and turn back, because your body, it's not just your brain. That's the thing a lot of people don't understand. It's almost like a physical manifestation of the stress. It's like urgent. It's like emergency flashing lights telling you pull over now. And you have to, the thing is because it's so overwhelming, a lot of people, they hold back. And that's what I had been doing. And then she's like 3 weeks. And then we're getting the psychiatrist involved in putting you on meds. I thought to myself, I was actually, I think at the time I was still nursing a baby, maybe. I didn't want to be on the meds. It was not necessarily the best, because some people will have to be, even if they're nursing, even if they're pregnant. But I was able to push through it, and I was like literally out loud to myself saying all of these mantras over and over as I'm driving to the street. And I get to a point, I think I actually got 3 blocks away. And I thought, I think I did it with my husband home. So my husband then turned around. I think he may have even driven the car back, but I did it. And the thing that's really strangely almost magical about it is once you fight one major compulsion or phobia, you suddenly find that the other ones will do one of two things. One of them will loosen up, and one of them is that they'll get worse. But the thing is once you fought the one and had success, even on a very small level, like I drove 3 blocks instead of 1, what ends up happening is you can now use that as also a mantra. I was able to do it the last time, so I can do it this time too.
Yeah, we've spoken a lot about the on this episode, the notion of living with the uncertainty, right? That reassurance to OCD actually exacerbates the problem rather than relieve it. And the treatment is about being able to live with the uncertainty. And yeah, it's possible I forgot my homework. It's possible the front door is unlocked. It's possible that there'll be a car accident. Did that come into play as well? Was that one of the mantras, the ability to embrace the uncertainty?
Yeah, I mean, it has to be like to the point where you realize the world is full of dangers and you can't avoid all of them. There is no way to avoid them, and you have to let go. You have to let go of control. You're not in control of the world. Hashem runs the world, and he does it according to his rules and his time frame. And there's nothing you can do to really, it's like he doesn't change even though we change. And so everything that we expect that we're doing when we're like trying to control things through the OCD, it doesn't make a difference. So getting a point, you have to get the point is, it's interesting because you simultaneously feel I'm in more control of what's going over me, but I'm in less control of the world, and that's okay.
Yeah. Rebecca, can you share a little bit about some family, without any details, family's response, family's reactions, family's ability to support somebody going through treatment for OCD? Are there things that they can do to help, to encourage? What are some practical tips that maybe you can share that have been helpful for you over the years?
So a lot of it depends on the quality of the relationship going into it or not. Mm-hmm. If somebody does not have a good relationship in the first place, I think they should actually just be generally supportive, and that's it. Like there's nothing they really can do either way. There's too much of a chance that they could either make it worse or do nothing at all. It's like I don't think there's a chance that they're going to make it better in general. It can actually help the relationship just being generally, they'll be like, I'm supportive and I hear this is hard for you and I understand. Also doing things like, for example, in a case where it's a member of a young couple and they have small children, like one of the things that I had to do is be practicing driving. So either my husband had to watch the kids, or sometimes my husband would be in the car with me. So somebody else had to help. So sometimes there will be a childcare. You have to have childcare in order to get to appointments sometimes, things like that. But the biggest thing is not be like, you're crazy, or this is going to like wreck you. Like some people have catastrophic thinking, I think is what they talk about it. Like this one thing is so big, or shame level, like let's not tell people about it. I mean, and I have to tell you, there is a lot of like people will like, one of the reasons I was hesitant to come on at first was because when I have written about it, I heard about it later. I would go to synagogue, and the first time I wrote something, I think it was on tablet, the entire time I'm in synagogue that day, I ended up having like people looking at me. There were people who looked at me and they're thinking, because it was one of the things I was talking about was having like interruptions with the like extreme thoughts while praying. And so I'm praying in synagogues. It's like the very place they know I had just written about. Right. So, and I mean, I've had one of my kids has had classmates who read things I wrote and were like, your mother's crazy. So there's still stigma around, I would say. But if you yourself are actively fighting that stigma and being encouraging and gentle, that's very helpful too.
Rebecca, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for sharing your story. Thank you for your writings. Maybe in closing, what were the reactions? That was some of the negative reaction to the writing when people abused your being vulnerable and sharing. But have you also received a lot of positive feedback? Where did you write those articles about OCD? Where could people find them, and what kind of response have you gotten?
One of them, I think, was you know how at the back of Ami there's personal essays? I think that's where one of them ran. That was the one about my driving phobia. And then there was another one I wrote about the experience of having scrupulosity and also like the importance of relying on a single Rav to and not do that. I'm going to go shop for the extra strict sack and then just to make yourself crazy, trying constantly to do that. Anyway, and the role of Amuna. So that was in Tablet. And particularly the Tablet article was, since it's available still online, I think last month I got, and it was like 10 years ago almost, maybe eight years ago I wrote about it. So as you can see, these it lasts a long time, and I get
because it resonates with people. And that's, Rabbi Goldberg and I always talk about how common, mental health and prevalent mental health issues are in our community. And this, writing about it, talking about it is yet another platform to have people connect to it and then, pursue some change, get some treatment for it, because their life can be happier.
Amazing. Well, people, I hope will still get in touch with you and read your articles on OCD and the many other articles that you've written on a wide range of topics. Thank you for the courage to share your story. Thank you for the insights. Thank you for being vulnerable. And we wish you easy and seamless cleaning and preparing for Pesach and beyond. Yeah. So thank you so much. Moshe, what do you think of the takeaways? We heard 3 fantastic conversations. For me, I learned an enormous amount. I know that you deal with these issues each and every day. What are some of the major takeaways for our audience?
I mean, it was fantastic. First of all, again, the courage of these individuals to share, and just giving us real practical manifestations of OCD. To me, I think the takeaway is twofold. Number one is that it really can express itself in so many different ways, whether it's, fear of being, crashing in a car or in an elevator. Rebecca shared about the tiles, her experiences. And it's fascinating to see how many different variations or ways OCD can express itself. It's not just washing your hands or being scared of a spider. And I think ultimately, really the treatment, Dr. Schwartz really was able to clearly express how, living and learning to live with the uncertainty and going through the exercises, the cognitive restructuring can be so practically helpful for so many. Very insightful. And I thought it was a great episode. Really learned a lot, actually.
Me too. And I'll tell you what I found so hopeful about, our episode on anxiety, our episode on trauma. We did learn techniques. We talked with hope about how it can be managed. But I thought this more than even those, the people we spoke to said, here's the good news about OCD. You really can learn to live with it. You really could learn to be in control of it. If you confront it, if you embrace what you need to do in order to manage it, there's really, really great news. And there's really a lot of hope. And you saw that, I think, in Mordy, in Rebecca, and from Dr. Schwartz as well. So I hope both the people going through it or those family and friends of those who are can take away and draw that strength and that hope from this, which really, really inspired me.
Yeah. And again, continuing the conversation is so critical. We mention this every time. Our goal here is just to have a platform to share, to discuss, to ultimately work towards an understanding that there are resolutions and there's a roadmap towards dealing with real mental health challenges. So share it, don't fear it, and we'll keep the conversation going.
And please be in touch with us. In the show notes on YouTube or the podcast player, you could find how to contact us, information. If you'd like to share your story, if there's a topic you think it's really important to Out of the Shadows to cover, let's keep the conversation going. Our goal is to remove and erase the stigma and the shame and to really enrich the community in addressing these issues, better mental hygiene, better mental health, and how we can be supportive to one another. So Moshe, thank you again for lending your expertise. It's really a privilege to partner on these episodes and on this topic. And we look forward to our next episode of Out of the Shadows.
Thank you.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Out of the Shadows. To help bring the show to a wider audience, please rate and review on Apple Podcasts. You can subscribe and find more episodes of Out of the Shadows on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. For further resources, be sure to check out the show notes.